Freundlich, dass Sie mich heute hören besuchen können. Mein Name ist Val Myers. Sprechen Sie Deutsch? Nein?
Nein.
Sie und ich will sprechen Spanisch, okay? Yeah. I'm sorry, old habits are hard to break. We're in the United States now, not the Rhine province of Prussia where I was born. I'll speak English for you. I was saying, good afternoon, I'm pleased that you can visit with me today. My name is Val Myers, but you can call me Val. I realize that none of you would have known me, but you may know some of my great-grandchildren that grew up here in Midair. Trela Darnell is still here. Others that live elsewhere are Carol Appenzeller, Peggy Henderson, and the boys, Larry and Dave, Ed and Steve, and Rick and Rod. Well, I was born in 1833 in the small town of Fallsdorf. That's in the very northern part of the country that you call Germany. My father, Lawrence, was a farmer, but I really don't remember him because he died when I was just a toddler. That made life rough for the 8 of us that were left, my mother, 3 sisters, 3 brothers, and me. So I did farm labor as soon as I was old enough to help out with the family expenses. By the time I was a young adult, I realized the future wasn't looking too good for me. So I decided to join some friends and neighbors that were going to immigrate to America. Those people will always be my friends, and I guess you could say they're still my neighbors. You may have seen some of their headstones as you came through the cemetery. Well, there were Appenzellers, Graffs, Emmicks, Woolenwebers. We all came here together in 1858 on the steamship Ariel. Now, being farmers, we headed straight for central Illinois, where we heard the farm ground was as rich as in our homeland. I found work right away working on William Vaughn's farm, making $12.50 a month. And I saved every penny of that I could because someday I wanted my own farm. Well, after working for Mr. Vaughn for, a little over 3 years, war broke out between the states of the North and the South. And I enlisted in the Union Army. Now, soldiers then were getting $13 a month with the first month paid in advance, and we got a $10 signing bonus. I was assigned to Company H of the 115th Illinois Volunteer Infantry, and I held the rank of private throughout the war. My life as a soldier was not a glamorous one. We did a lot of marching, and we had a lot of practice with our weapons, but we also had a lot of downtime. Quite frankly, bored much of the time. Anytime we had to travel some long distance, normal supply lines couldn't keep pace. So we had to forage for ourselves to supplement the small amounts of food that we did carry with us. Now that meant that we could go out and hunt wild game. Sometimes we would buy or borrow some fruit, vegetables, and eggs from nearby residents. We could only hope that in filling our canteens that we were upstream, if you get my meaning. Well, in September of 1863, our unit and several others marched all day and overnight to a region in the north part of Georgia called Chickamauga Creek. Now, this was a very strategic area between Chattanooga, Tennessee and Atlanta, Georgia. Capturing that land would lead to the fall of Chattanooga, which was a major railway supply center for the Southern cause. At this point in the war, we had been on several scouting missions, and we'd had a few minor skirmishes with the rebels, but this was sizing up to be our first major fight. Once we arrived at the front lines, we were given very little time to rest and get something to eat. Our officers placed us behind rocks and trees on one side of a very wide and rolling meadow. We could see the rebels maneuvering on the far side. Once we were all in place, our artillery opened up on them to try to soften their lines a little bit, and of course their cannons replied with the same tune. Well, after a while that shelling stopped, and we got the order to attack. We came out from behind those rocks and trees like a single well-oiled unit. And we went after those rebels, shouting and yelling top of our lungs, maybe with a little swearing thrown in, pardon me ladies. We went after those rebs and we drove them back. And then they counterattacked and drove us back. And this fighting went on for most of the daylight hours. And then just before dark, the shooting would stop and wagons would come out from our side and from their side to gather up the soldiers that had fallen during the day. Now, this fight went on for the better part of 3 days before our generals decided to abandon the fight. They say this was the last major victory for the Confederacy in the war between the states, but, I don't know how anyone could call this Battle of Chickamauga Creek a victory. Well, there were almost 40,000 casualties with the number killed, wounded, captured. I was one of those casualties. I was wounded and captured on the final day of that battle, and I spent the next 17 months in 5 different Confederate prison camps, including Andersonville in Georgia. Maybe you've heard some of the horror stories of that place. It truly was a hell on earth. It was about 20 acres in size. That would be like taking 2 of these cemeteries and blocking them together. It was intended to hold about 10,000 prisoners of war, but it often held 30,000 prisoners of war. It was partially laid out on swamp ground. Any trees that had been in the area had been cut down and were serving as the barricade walls. We had no shelter from the rain or the searing heat of the day or the cold winter nights. Well, the only shelter we had were the tents that we had carried in with us. Fresh water was a rare commodity. Our rations were short, usually putrid. Latrines were somewhere between poorly constructed and non-existent. But everything was in such short supply that some of our own men took to robbing fellow prisoners of their food and clothing. I had to have somebody watch my possessions while I slept, and then I would return the favor to him. Well, after a few months of this exposure to the elements and living conditions, many of our men were in rags if they were wearing anything at all. While I was being held there at Andersonville, the Union Army's General Sherman began his march to the sea. Well, that was a battle plan to cut the Confederacy in half and shorten the war. The commanders at our prison camp at Andersonville were concerned that Sherman would come our way, set us prisoners free, and that we would be returned to serving in the Union Army. So those of us that could still walk were moved to a prison camp in Florence, South Carolina. Conditions at that place were not much better than at Andersonville. And it was there at the Florence prison camp that I volunteered to be a surgical nurse. I thought this would be a better use of my time than to sit around idle all day. While I was being held there at the Florence prison camp, I became acquainted with another prisoner from Paducah, Illinois, John January. Mr. January was suffering terribly from prison. He had gang green. Think about the worst odor you've ever encountered. Multiply that tenfold. You'll have an idea of what it's like to be around someone whose flesh is rotting from gangrene. Well, Mr. January was destined to die unless those infected feet were removed, and removed very soon. I alerted one of the doctors to his plight, but he refused to operate, saying, well, that man's going to die soon anyway, and I want him to go to heaven with his feet on. Well, another nurse and I felt differently. So we carried Mr. January to a surgical table, and while the other gentleman held January down, I amputated both his feet, about 5 inches above each ankle, with a pocket knife. Now, it wasn't all that difficult, really, because the gangrene had rotted his bones, making my job somewhat easier, and I had assisted the doctors in several surgeries of this type, so I felt confident that I could perform this operation and close the wounds properly. Well, Mr. January survived that operation, and we both survived the prison camps. We were liberated by Union troops in February of 1865. Now, the war was over 2 months later in April when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. With the turmoil that comes from ending a war, this one compounded by the fact that President Lincoln was assassinated less than a week later, it took another 3 months before I was finally mustered out of the Army. By the time I returned to Manier in July of '65, I had saved enough money to buy my first 80 acres of land at the inflated price of $12 an acre. I hope people aren't having to pay that much for farm ground now. So about a year after I returned from the war, I married Katharina Graff. Now, she had come to America with her family back in '58 on the same ship that I had. So I hadn't paid any attention to her then. Well, at that time, she was an 11-year-old girl, and I was a 24-year-old man. When I returned from the war, she was 18, and she changed a lot. Eventually, we had more than 500 acres to support us and our 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls. One of our boys moved to Iowa, and he lies to rest out there. 2 of our boys and 1 of our daughters are here at the Manier Cemetery, and 2 of our boys and the other daughter are lying at rest at Main Cemetery between here and Mackinac. And from their graves, you can see the land that we used to farm. I was one of the founders of St. John's Church here at Manier, but back in our day, we just called it the German Church. I'll let you figure out why we called it that. I also had a sense of civic duty, and I served as road commissioner for several years, and I also served a few years on the school board. Now, long after my years of farming and public service, I had a really nice surprise. Remember that Mr. January I was telling you about? Well, he came to visit me here in Manier around 1906, I think it was. By then, he had recovered from his prison weight of 45 pounds to a more robust 200 pounds, and he was wearing prosthetic feet, walking only slightly with a limp. I think I may have a photograph of him over here that you could look at. Well, I died the following year, 1907, at the ripe old age of 73. I was ready to go, though, because I'd been ill for a few months, and they think I might have had stomach cancer. So I just spend my time out here next to Katharina now. Folks, I hope you've enjoyed this visit this afternoon as much as I have, and I hope you come back and visit me sometime. You know where to find me. Auf Wiedersehen und viel Glück. Goodbye, and good luck. How long the wind will get those up there.
Well, oh my goodness.
This large one is a drawing that was made shortly after the prisoners were liberated by Union troops. Oh, I'm just going to lay them down. This was taken somewhere between 1890 and 1900.